aggressive uh, central bankers that I know we have had. We talk about getting rid of exchange control. Well, he isn't getting rid of it, but he's been liberalizing it on many fronts, and of course has given the Bahamas the distinction of having the first central bank backed digital currency in the world. I take a little credit for that because he used to be a colleague when we were in college. So I'm thinking that I encouraged him to be that. But it doesn't surprise me. When we were in school, he was a double major and he was a distinction in both majors. He's just a brilliant fellow and a wonderful colleague. And so it is my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, um, to bring our keynote speaker up for this afternoon to you, the governor of the central bank, Mr. John Rolle. Governor?
So good afternoon, and thank you very much, Zhivargo. It's a pleasure to be back here at another one of the Global Interdependence Center events. This is supposed to be an update on the, the sand dollar, um, but it'll probably be very little by way of update on the sand dollar because I think it's in there. It's in there. It's in there. But it how much time do we have? It's very likely that I have 30 minutes. Okay, good. Um, no, I just want that's not the later stage because I think we speak a lot in the Bahamas about lots of things. We're very passionate with local governments. We're very passionate about our banking sector and competition and everything. What is what I sometimes say to people that I don't know how relevant it is in the context of some of what we may discuss, but if there are commercial opportunities in an economy, um, entrepreneurs and others will always, gravitate to them. They're not going to walk away from money making ideas. And I say that to say that sometimes when we look at the landscape and we're so puzzled, say, well, why isn't this happening? Why isn't that happening? It should be happening. Um, I believe that we sometimes neglect the fact that those who are looking at those issues, um, if they saw those as having the kind of opportunities, you would see actions taking place. But the other side of it, though, is that in a business setting, the return horizon is incredibly truncated, and if you're not very careful, often you'll be looking at the long-term, national benefits. You may not necessarily get what is best because, contrary to popular belief, yes, contrary to popular belief, the idea of perfect competition and the invisible hand was only put in the textbook so they could teach us economics. And then after they taught us the economics, they relaxed all the assumptions. And as soon as they started relaxing the assumptions, you could justify so many of the public policies that we see, even tariffs. So to understand that. Um, but the other thing that I wanted to say, in case sort of we can get in perspective, is this is a country of 400,000 people. That is not a lot. A banking sector of, I think maybe between 10, 12 billion if I'm lucky, the total balance sheet. So that's the size of the sector. And even when we talk about economic growth and the outlook, right now the Bahamas is settled on a cruising path of roughly 1.5 to 2% per annum. And then the other thing I tell people when we look at that is when you're looking at it from a business opportunity point of view, there are two possibilities. Either you're competing for existing market share or you're participating in a growth momentum. If you're participating in a growth momentum, then at the aggregate, we're capped at whatever our potential is, unless on average we can do things to increase that potential. And, and a lot of what we're doing, whether it's in energy policies or making our payment systems more efficient, is to make to increase those potential, notwithstanding productivity and all of the other issues. So what I'm going to do today, insofar as we're talking about payments, is yes, I will give an update on where we are with the digital currency initiative, but also let you see some of the other developments that are happening in the payment space that I think are very important. And sometimes I also like to remind Bahamians, because I'm glad that we have a lot of our American friends here. They say, well, oh, we do this or they do that in America. So why are we trying to do this or that? When I went to college in Canada, I saw things that were happening in Canada, innovation wise, that were not yet adopted in the US. And also, when you look across the globe, if you're trying to design, in some cases, policies, that you have to recognize that you can draw examples from other areas. And in the space of payments, I think too, some of our motivation is is because we aren't always seeing the wider picture of where the innovation is happening globally. And I think I fear particularly for my enterprise sector because in the global settings, they need to be able to keep up and move at the speed of business. And the speed of payments is the part of the speed of business. And that speed of payments isn't necessarily the speed of payments in the Bahamas. We got to equip and retrofit this economy to keep up with the speed of payments globally. So that I think that's part of it. And so some of the things that you might do in your enterprise setting may be of very little relevance domestically, but if you're doing business on an international basis, you would find that it matters insofar as payments are concerned. In in our case, when we looked at the just as a recap very quickly, our a lot of this what we do in the digital currency field, we talk about payment system modernization, and that's important because it shows you that this is just an element, and even without this element, a lot of the other work is important. So we're focused on a lot of these initiatives from the early 2000s, but in there is the continued stress on financial inclusion in recent times, particularly when you had the experience of Hurricane Dorian and the others. You come to appreciate the importance of resilience in terms of the how quickly your economy can recover from setbacks, and notwithstanding, however we might assess, the state of telecoms and all of those, it is much faster to get communications back up in a wireless system, irrespective of connectivity, than it is to run 100 or more miles of hard lines, say, in an island community after a natural disaster. So when we think about resilience, we're thinking about how quickly you can get, those communities back up and running. And those issues of resiliency matter particularly for countries like the Bahamas, in some cases more so than for advanced countries. And I like to use the example of Abaco after Hurricane Dorian. It took, I think, in some cases, almost 2 years to get certain physical infrastructure up. But those who were connected electronically at whatever level, they were able to do things after. And in some cases, the only businesses that function afterwards were those who could use their cellular connection and tether it and operate their credit card. So it's a very vivid illustration in terms of how you should be defining resilience. For us too, we're looking at it from the point of view of giving the entire population access to payments, technology, and the services that they can get through the digital channels. And just piggybacking of the conversation I had at lunch, it is very important in this context also to get your small businesses on board, because when you look at cost in financial services and the like, usually, it has a disproportionate impact on smaller enterprises. And so you really need to deal with how they can be included in a participatory way in terms of the economic space. In our payment system modernization efforts, the early advances had to do with just digitizing the settlement process. So we had a real gross time settlement system, which the central bank funded, and then the commercial banks funded the automated clearinghouse, and so that digitized, the check settlement process, and now it's more prominent for electronic funds transfer. We also, as part of this process, in the period leading up to the 2020s, focus on opening up the space so that fintech type firms could come in and provide electronic money payment services. And so that was the one of the first moves in terms of expanding beyond the banking space insofar as certain types of services were concerned. And in that context, some of what we looked at for a central bank digital currency made sense because you needed to have a space where all of the platforms could communicate with each other. So the interoperability was important. And so that's a foundation that we will always have as the space grows in the future. And no startup in that space has to worry about whether they have the critical mass to be viable in a siloed setting, because as long as they're interoperable, they benefit from however the entire space moves and advance. And interoperability also speaks in a very reinforcing way to a lot of the competition and related issues, because if you're too small to have the network effects in many cases, you don't benefit from the competition forces. So in our payment space, yes, the traditional space are the banks. Um, Most of the commercial banks are in some way or the other plugged in and operating through the ACH and the RTGS. And then we have I like to call them the money services firm, because we used to think in terms of the money transmission business. And we had the payment providers that just came into the space to provide digital wallet services. But it's all money transmission. And so that distinction really is something that will fall away at some point, even in terms of how we treat the sector from a policy point of view. But even though we have about six fintech non-bank providers in the payment space, their level of activity is varying. So you wouldn't say that all six of them are the same strength, but there are also a mix of other business models in there that keep some of these firms viable. If you're looking at the payment space in the Bahamas, and this is an interesting contrast as well. Um, what we did here was just to give you an idea, and this is also important for illustration purposes. We only have 400,000 people in this country, and not all 400,000 of them have accounts. And I say that too because when we talk about the electronic money space, we talk about 130,000 accounts. Those are accounts. So if I scale that relative to the fact that if I'm just looking at savings and checking accounts that have $10,000 or less on them, and you can see from the chart that there's not much difference between that population and those that have up to 1 million in them, so which is in the other category from 10,000 and up. But the bottom line is you could probably use that as a proxy for what's happening transactional wise. And so on average, you have maybe 3 or 4 accounts. In some cases, more than one at the individual bank you deal with. But it's reasonable to assume, based on this, that the mobile wallet or electronic money space is impacting maybe about 20% of us presently on some level or the other if you just use the proportional scaling. But in terms of transactions in that space presently, it's much less. Um, Not yet 2% of what I think is an estimate of retail payments. And so I think it really defines to some extent the upside potential, not so much displacing credit cards, debit cards, and the like, but looking at the fact that cash usage is still, you know, 30, maybe 50% of retail. Now I say retail because there's a table in the central bank's report that will show you that close to $40 billion in payments move through our domestic payments system each year. So, but the the larger bulk would be wholesale payments between the banks and the others. But in the retail space, you can see that credit cards in the Bahamas, we spend well over $1 billion in terms on an annual basis in terms of purchases. If you add cash advances to those numbers, it will probably be at least 100 million more. That's churn. The actual amount of balances that you're carrying on your credit cards is less than 100 million in the aggregate, according to what the banks report. So that's a very important context. What you don't see there are debit cards. And what we see recently is that in some of the more recent period, there's been some shift to greater use of debit cards than credit cards because I guess people see the cash equivalent. So you see that particularly since the pandemic. In terms of the retail types of payment, check clearing and electronic fund transfers. So those would be, the payroll and all of those very probably tedious transactions you're doing now through your online trans system where you're sending payments to users. And we're trying to make that part of your life a little bit easier by equipping you to use aliases and other peer-to-peer means if you're talking about revolutionizing the digital space. But part of it is also getting you empowered to choose non-cash means. You could stay with cash. Cash is going to be here. I wouldn't say forever, but it'll probably feel like forever. So, and no one is really, um, worried about that. But what is more important is anyone who needs to have the ability to use a non-cash alternative shouldn't, for any technical reasons, be prevented from doing that. So that's one of the nice ways of, I think, trying to define what's involved from a financial inclusion point of view, whether it's a business that insists on accepting cash or a business that's only accepting cash but is struggling to wire themselves to accept other payments. So that's very important. The area in the Bahamas where I think there's been a lot of focus recently has been as well the checks. And from the central bank perspective, we're not really focused so much at this stage in terms of check elimination. It's something to revisit at a later date, but the really greater emphasis is understanding the factors behind why we're using checks on a residual basis and how you can also use to motivate, the sort of fundamental improvement in payments. But we have seen significant a reduction in check usage. And there was a bit of a discernible drop in the period just after the pandemic. We probably could have gone faster because I would expect that given even the innovations that have happened since then on the banking platforms, people would have likely responded even differently in the 2021 period. So when we introduce the digital currency into this mix, the the issue really is addressing concerns that individuals have around the safety, and this applies for any mobile wallet product. The Sound Dollar does not exist in isolation from any of the products that are out there, whether it's Canoe, Suncash, uh, MoneyMax, Mobile Assist. I say to them, if you're like the baker. This is just the ingredient for whatever it is that you're baking. It is not a an idea that is in competition. It is really the platform, but it is getting people to understand and th- how safety issues are um, being addressed. Because I think we could all appreciate when you think about cybersecurity and all of those areas, you know, what's important, the convenience. Um, it's we focus on making it low cost. I was supposed to demonstrate the convenience, but it's too late now because I was supposed to let you who don't have a wallet, if one of you before the presentation was up could have set yourself up with a wallet, then I would have given you about $400 before I finished. And you would have had the $400 to spend right away, the fresh market, super value, etc. There would have been no hole on your funds. What you see is what you would have had. Well, I guess it's too late. I might have to call the bank and tell them bring the money. Yeah. But no, but the convenience of it is one of the things that we're trying to get across. And so having that infrastructure, um, the next thing then is to focus on how you push adoption. And again, from a maturity point of view, there's still a lot more that needs to happen in our infrastructure space. And for that, we've set up and resourced, our Sand Dollar Adoptions Unit, and their goal really is to address in a regimented, and I would say that this is going to be a gradual process. Regimented way, get people not just accustomed to using a digital wallet to make payment, but just understanding all of the factors that tie into it and addressing the concerns that they have. I think the greater concern that individuals have would be around the security of using digital platforms. But there are also convenience issues around, surprisingly, as you go digital, people still want to feel as if they're connected to cash. So some of what we're doing also is to address the ease of having access to cash. And again, when you put this in the context of our family island communities, their lives are not easy because it's cash based, because getting cash into those communities is incredibly difficult, even for financial institutions. And so that's part of the underserviced challenge. And it's part of the underserviced challenge that you realize when you start to take the digital payments instrument even into some of these newer communities like Acklands and Crooked Island, because now you realize, well, they never had ATM machines before, so you have to put some ATMs in there. And so in Acklands and Crooked Island, for example, you would have seen some of the new providers having to put in cash dispensing machines, which would not have been an issue. But ultimately, you get to a point in the future where people can even further disconnect from that. And even if you look in the case of North Andros, the ability of having some of the improved cash services, um, what has helped, I think, in terms of the the modest inroads that we've seen. But the from an adoption point of view, the focus really is on, and this is critical, get growing the merchant base. That's not just as simple as getting businesses to sign up, but also um, making certain that they have the traffic. And so a part of that means as well, when I look at the government and in the private sector, making disbursements to individuals that have digital wallets. And so we have an infrastructure that achieves that, but we still need to go a little bit further in terms of how some of those proprietary platforms integrate some of the core developments that the central bank has done. Um, the financial inclusion push means that our adoptions unit is really concentrated most on moving through the family islands and so building relationship with those communities. And a big part of that is educational and also, interacting with the merchants. Central bank doesn't provide any direct services, but because you're part of that space, you have to collaborate with the payment providers because there's really them that are delivering the services. But in many cases, we provide the connectivity and connect with those individuals to make certain that the even those fintech startups are developing, and even for them, I think from a resourcing point of view, it's it's a very strenuous process. So what we did, just by way of update, we introduced what we call Wallet 2.0. And the significance of Wallet 2.0, for what I should have done at the beginning, is you can download the app and you can set up an account, right? Within minutes, as long as or as fast as your data connection is. And once that's done, it's AML compliant, it's FATF compliant, all of that. Um, you can go to the next level if you need to, and you can um, do additional levels of verifications remotely as well. You don't have to travel to any physical location. And you have an account that's on par with any account in any deposit facility, low risk deposit facilities. So that was one of the very important things we did. We also perfected at the core the ability for individuals to change providers. So portability is a feature. Um, and some other issues around how individuals manage the security of their account using two-factor authentication and the like. But again, these are all happening what we like to call the white label app. Ultimately, the Bahamas is going to evolve where mobile payment apps will likely uh, retire any app that the central bank has out there. But I think in terms of some of what needs to be done initially, it's easier to do it in this way. So as I mentioned, in terms of the numbers, right now there are about 135, probably closer to 140,000 wallets in use. But and many of you have multiple wallets. Um, but on average, people might still only be, in some cases, spending, 20, $30. Um, so a very small amount within, say, maybe weeks or months. So the really important goal is to be able to grow that space. And because we're connected to the ACH now, we have the ability to do top ups through the ACH. And doing an ACH top up to a digital wallet, it's the same as sending money to any deposit account in the Bahamas. So what I wanted to show you, if we can show the video now, is at least two examples of the use cases where the uh, entities have used the digital wallets in order to get people set up to receive payment, and it's helping particularly in, I think, in the case of the North Andros community. Nice group of restaurants. We found that we have a pretty large portion of our employment pool that had difficulty getting bank accounts. While the key issue we had previously was getting cash, getting funds on the island. And with only one working ATM, the idea of the sand dollar just it being digital and everybody has a smartphone nowadays, it actually worked into our favor. The sand dollar was like a godsend because it allowed us to add it to our payroll system, which means we're able to send their money to the sand dollar wallet. It's still a bank transfer because you get an account number. So from the employer side of things, all I have to do is send your funds just as usual. It opens up our pool for us to be able to hire some of the people that we couldn't hire before because they were unable to open bank accounts. This has been a really good solution. He does is they to accelerate the onboarding of their employees and to deal with the payroll issues. Um, they no longer have to have stockpiles of cash, so they just do the ACH transfers, and then cash needs are dealt with outside of that. I know that there's some you know testing of the same types of concept in, I think, either Auckland or Crooked Island. I don't know, don't quote me on which of the two islands, but I know that there is also, I think maybe in the construction sector. But the intention there is that you can get people more rapidly set up. And once they're in these wallets, the what we call redemption or deposit. So depositing funds from a mobile wallet back into a bank account is also enabled because it's the system is connected to the ACH, and so you can send transfer from your wallet to a designated account, and that that is successful. Implementation is complete in the white label app that the central bank has provided. Many of the financial institutions to have digital wallets have completed the implementation to receive funds from a bank transfer. So depending on the provider you have, if you look at your account number, it's probably a 12-digit number, which um, basically is coding your ACH routing and whatever your unique account number is. And so that's the help with the top up. And so having the two-way movement of funds in those residual cases is a very important priority for us. The In terms of where we go, part of adoptions really is getting government equipped and working with governments, capacity bandwidth to some extent to do some of that. Um, there wouldn't be an issue with government making payments, but part of where we want to do this is in the cash districts, places like Athens, Crooked Island, and the like. So you got to perfect the rest of the ecosystem in those communities as well. And so that small amount of extra work is very important for us to conclude, so that we can do that. The Working with the commercial banks, we've worked up to this point a lot with Bank of the Bahamas, so they've done some trials and tests, uh, and pacing ourselves. That too is not going to be a big bang, So we have to work with the commercial bank at a sustainable pace. Uh, on all of their platforms, the payment to a sound dollar wallet is one of the options. For those of you familiar with online banking, um, you can choose in their drop-down menu that option, and you can send funds once you know the address of the wallet. What we also want to do is focus on what is termed in the industry offline payments, basically meaning that you can complete a payment even if you don't have data connection or signal. So that's very important. And it's interesting, hey, as soon as the central bankers decide to create digital currency, offline came up. But you don't talk about offline in the case of your other payment options that you have. So they don't have offline capabilities, generally speaking. But that is really a focus here because it's supposed to say, well, if this is cash, cash is always available. And the technology that's out there suggests that it's feasible. So it's just how we would implement it for the Bahamas. And for us, I think too, it's important to begin to think about how you open up the payment space a lot more to fintech developers so that they can really do the true business of developing the applications that matter for businesses and the like. Everything that we've done up to this point, as far as we're concerned, is just the plain vanilla stuff. If people come behind and they know what they're doing, they can put any amount of bells and whistles on the system. And that's really the objective, not so much that we even dream that we can provide, all of the sophisticated apps that businesses might think about. What is important now, just before I close, is that when we started to talk a lot about the check elimination process, it really surfaced, I think, a lot of the concerns around payments, how the system functions, how quickly payments settled, et cetera, et cetera. And so it gave us an opportunity as well to address again in a more holistic way some of the issues. So one of the important one for us is making certain that the entire system is fast payment real time. And when I say fast payment real time, yes, from bank to bank, but the, the lure of fast payments in real time is that once we perfect that in the Bahamas, um, integrated into digital currency, you'll be able to make a payment at a point of sales, whether you have a credit card or not, because you'll be able to also do an instant payment to the merchant, or you'll be able to do an instant payment to anyone else that has a digital wallet in the Bahamas, as opposed to um, whatever means that you use now. And it's really also positioning us with all of the innovations that are happening globally, because the global standard really is to get your payment from here to the other side of the world within minutes, maybe hours, on terms of the upper tolerance, but not days. And so you need to make certain that internally you can receive a payment ever delivered to you within those same time bands as well. And yes, the global target also is to ensure that the cost of those payments are incredibly reduced, particularly, I mean, if you understand what it costs to send on average a money transfer, um, and appreciate that a lot of the costs that you pay in payments aren't necessarily going to the local financial institution. They're covering participation within wider network and infrastructure. And so if you make the entire infrastructure efficient, then those savings pass along to all of the participants. The So some of the work that we're focused on, though, even as we look at the fast payment side, is how uh, we get what we currently experience faster in terms of settling, the speed of opening up accounts. There's no regulatory rule as to how long it should take for you to open up an account. The digital wallet providers, there's none. The digital wallet providers, they ask for ID as well. But as you're sitting there, because they have already the infrastructure, you can create your account, you can send them your ID while you sit it there, you can do whatever other biometrics, and they can complete that process. That's regulatory compliant, but you have to have the infrastructure to do that. So from that point of view, that speaks to one of the areas around the speed of opening. But we also think the project that the Bahamas embarked on a few years ago to deal with the national identification, it was supposed to be a digital, but that's very important because it will also um, accelerate the connectedness that people often need to complete these types of setup. The other thing that we're working on is the basic bank account, which has again some very targeted financial inclusion elements, and sometimes it's referred to as a transactional account. Basically, it recognizes that people need to have electronic facilities to make payments, and it ties in seamlessly with fast payments and digital wallets and the like. And it basically says all of your financial institutions, once the framework is in place, would need to, in the retail services space, provide this option to customers of a particular economic mean. We've proposed in the Bahamas that it be targeted, so it's not that everyone gets this fee restricted facility. I hope no one in here qualifies for it, right? Because then that would mean that you're above the um, probably the economic, threshold. But the bottom line is that you don't want anyone deciding not to be a part of the formal system because they can't afford to, because then it doesn't benefit the system. And that's part of what's involved with the basic bank account, aside from other exclusionary issues that people encounter. For us, other emphasis, yes, public education, as I mentioned earlier. We also want to emphasize that the cash supply network in the Bahamas is still a challenge. And we foresee that some aspect of regulation would need to come into being here. And and so what that looks like is going to be a matter as well as for public consultation. And I think it's going to be an incredibly um, challenging thing, because most of the times when people talk about how bad banking is, and they talk about North or they talk about Eleuthera, but our solutions got to work in Ragged Island and Maguana and Atkinson Crooked Island too. So it ain't a solution if it can't work in those areas. And that's when you start to see, um, you know, the uphill, climb that you have to do necessarily do in order to get those communities connected. And I think that helps. And it probably provides an advantage to a country like the Bahamas from an innovation point of view, because now you're really being challenged in terms of whether what you develop is scalable and is not only applicable to New Providence or Grand Bahama. And even in New Providence, I don't think we sometimes feel as if the access to cash is adequate, right? But but that's not even the challenge in terms of the solutions that need to be addressed. And all of this really is the public education addressing a lot of the consumer financial protection issues. And for the Bahamas, some of those are really around transparency and better, service levels in terms of how we interact with the customers to resolve issues. Some will relate probably to, aspects of fee setting and the like. But again, we do not yet in the Bahamas, I would say, have a elaborate elaborated process, particularly for financial product and services. Yes. Perhaps in the case of investment, because that's really a big focus of securities regulation, the protection of those in the space. But it's going to be for us, we think, separate and apart from just what happens in your banking financial product space, any other area in which you're using financial services, whether it's insurance or others, those will also matter in terms of what a consumer financial protection regime looks like. So to conclude, I would say that we still got a long distance to go, but we've covered a lot of ground already, and I think focusing on building the rapport with the family island communities, the public education, um, bringing the banks fully into the space, getting the government and others fully on board is very important. And I'll just government's credit. Some of the early product um, uses during COVID, it was a good illustration of how quickly the the fintechs could quickly mobilize to help government disperse payments. But that was just for transitory business opportunities. Um, Moving beyond that, they really have to find, their viability in the other space, right? But it does not mean that there is not scope for some of the legacy means of making payments to transition. Now, when I say legacy, that's not going to mean taking somebody's existing salaries and channeling them somewhere else, because in all likelihood, you already have a financial relationships and obligations tied to those, so you can't upend those. Um, but looking at the other areas from a financial inclusion or exclusion point of view, how you can bring people into the system and have a very, very integrated and connected system. And being gradual really emphasizes that, the family islands really matter for this. And for it to work and to make sense, it has to sink in those communities, and then we let it sort of, I guess, permeate upward into other parts. And I think that, yep, to my earlier point, I think the last bullet says it a lot. Um, we have a lot of P2P, P2B, and P2G. Now, to complete that process, you need the business sector and the government sector now to get on the other side, and where those gaps exist to be uh, making the disbursements outward. So that's summarized a lot of the work that I think is ahead of us, in addition to probably lots of the comments and observations that you probably have. So thank you, Zhivargo.
Thank you, Governor. So, Governor's done two things wrong. Two things. He didn't bring out $400, and he's left you a narrow space for questions and answers, but that's okay. And so, uh, the, the, the the first thing I wanted to ask you, just quickly, Governor, is when this is when having instituted the sand dollar, if it fully plays out as you had hoped when you created it, what would the Bahamas look like?
Well, I think this is moving along as a friction from payment and commerce. We, I don't think we appreciate how costly it is for businesses if they don't have the full flexibility and
We don't appreciate.
or we see it from the point of view of um, the service charges and whatnot are being assessed. But I don't think we often appreciate that those charges are symptomatic of what um, the commercial sector is experiencing. So to the extent that those become less of issues in payments, I think that's important. Now the challenge for the Bahamas again is that the scale, 400,000. It's not a very large base, and so from that point of view, um, even with technology, if we're not careful, um, efficiency issues could still haunt us.
Any of our international guests can imagine living in a space where there is no bank and no bank machine? Any of you? Could you conceive of such a scenario? That is the reality for any number of islands in this country. I remember I was in the United States one time driving to somewhere. When I got halfway down the middle, I realized I had no gas. So I went, pulled into the gas station, and I had no wallet. I'm thinking, how is this going to happen? And it dawned on me, I had a card on my phone, and that was how I got the gas, which is where so many of these family island residents are finding themselves, is how to transact without a bank machine, right? So, answer sand dollar. Any questions quickly? Yes, ma'am.
To this environment that they are actually um, upright. And even when you talk about not using, for instance, before Christmas, I used my credit card, and normally I try to use cash in this environment for the same reason. And even though I have on my card to say send me a message every time a transaction. No transactions were posted. I went to the States into the new year and then I found out my card has been compromised. But now it's going to take 3 months, the bank is saying, even though I went to the police and reported the fraud activity for my card to clear. So I have no I'm not motivated to use my credit card because of the fraud development. And even you talk about, which I think is great, people entering the space of creating transfer systems. But do you all have any regulations? The concern I have over checks, Governor, is that checks have been evolved over a long time, and we have put into place. And I'm in an IT environment, so I am all for digital if we could find a way. But in the check environment, we've been doing that for so long. We have ways to protect. You have cross checks. You have different things that have developed over time to close the gaps that people have found to defraud the system. But in the digital space, it's new and there's a lot of fraud going on. And how do we, as consumers, protect? Like I say, I don't have use of my credit card now for another 3 months, whilst CIBC decides they're going to take 3 months to investigate the fraud, even though I've tried to ask them to go with me to the police because there are some obvious ones that we can find out. Like if you use your credit card for Bahamas here, you think that would be an easy one to figure out who. And they're telling me it's 3 months. So for 3 months now, I have very little use of my credit card.
And how were they able to say to you 3 months? You're the second person I've heard this on the exact same
And I need to
3 months.
travel and I have 3 months now, so I have to go apply for another credit card or I have no use. And going into other jurisdictions like the US and others, you have to have a credit card.
Yeah.
You can't tell me you're going to give me $500 in a credit card for the next 3 months.
Yeah.
It's crazy,
Governor?
right?
No,
So the
that's
protections are not in place in my mind that have developed for checks over the time is in the digital space, and therefore it allows for a lot of fraud for development in the digital
well,
space.
checks checks are more prone to fraud than people realize. And and with technology, it is even more exploitable than in the past. And so even with checks, you need to have, I would say, street smarts around how you manage um, the protection. Um, some of the areas in which you're not exploited, check fraud in the Bahamas, is only because the technology that is applied for payments, in some cases, is a little bit antiquated. So it wasn't that they did it to protect you, they just never caught up with some of the other innovations around how checks are being cashed in some of the other places. But for us, the real focus is you can never let up on the cybersecurity side. And a big part of the cybersecurity firewall, separate and apart from your financial institution, is yourself as an individual. Um, and all of the different ways in which you can be sensitized. You almost like have to develop, in my view, a level of instinct around this stuff. Because the way the cyber fraud is coming at you, if you send out an email to, 100,000 people and say, oh, we couldn't deliver your package. Can you please go online and put in some information? You look at it and say, oh, that's stupid. But there's a good chance somewhere in that 100,000 is a good couple dozen who did have a package that was coming that day and forget and accidentally compromise themselves. So the street smarts of it really is very important so that as individuals we appreciate that we really are the first line of defense against a lot of the fraud. Um, I can assure you though that for the financial institutions and others, they put a lot of energy into the the protection around their space. So where you experience fraud, it is very likely that it is happening somewhere in the usage space or somewhere in the space where some enterprise may have been compromised. But again, always advisable to follow whatever the security advice you're given around managing the accounts. Because yeah, I've also experienced um, the the fraud. I was literally in the office and we were getting alert that somebody was spending on a credit card downtown in London. And it was funny because I mean looking at it, it was funny because then you could see, oh, they spent here and they spent there, but you're in the Bahamas. So I mean
I had 9 transactions in Eastern Europe in 2 hours on one of mine. 9.
but the other thing that I must say about this, and I tell this to people all the time, you walk out here and you drop your wallet with $500 in it. And you come to the central bank and say, oh, I dropped my wallet with $500 in it. Central bank can't help you. That's $500 cash. But somebody accidentally spent $1,000 on your credit card or deducted $1,000 from your account with a debit card. There's a transactions trail that can be used in many cases to make you whole again. So even with the risk that are sometimes involved in the digital space, the recovery remedies are a lot more satisfactory than when you lose paper cash. And I think you also have to be mindful of that when you think about the security elements.
Anyone else?
Right here.
One more.
Good
Yes, ma'am.
afternoon. Thank you, Governor, for your presentation. My question is, yes, we want to advance, but with the implementation of the digital wallet, and the proposed elimination of checks. Has there been any consideration for the elderly, the illiterate, and the poor?
Yes, I think precisely when you look at the groups that are on the margins, it motivates so much more how you address public education and how you reach out to them in terms of, because you don't want them to live in an alternative existence. So really you have to focus on how you bring them along. One of the things that the group that you didn't mention, but everybody thinks about a lot more too, maybe the visually impaired
Yes.
or the others. So even in those cases, you have to make certain that you design products so that they can be, brought in. But for the poor, I think the example of the basic bank account, it matters, right? Because I was stunned when I look at my bank statement and I realized, oh my goodness, this can't be true that I'm paying 20 something dollars a month for whatever. And I checked the statement and it was there, right? But that's, you know, a meal for a family, right? And
Yes.
that's the difference between whether they decide that they even want an account.
Yes.
And so you can't have people trying to decide whether they should have it or not because it's going to take literally food out of their mouth. And so I think that's why we have to get something like the basic a basic transactional account in place so that you deal with the concerns that individuals like those would have, even if you cannot solve the concern that the population at large have around it.
Have you embarked on looking at that?
Yeah, we started to, and we have examples. I would say very clear and well laid out regulations from even some countries in the Caribbean that I mean they were very kind to share with us what what they've structured, and I think the examples, the Caribbean examples that I saw, would have been copied from some of the European countries that these communities are connected to. So we have a good idea as to how they lay out the approach, and we think it should be very easy to adapt for the Bahamas.
Other question.
Yeah, Governor, one quick question, another question. As far as I know, the legal tender of the Bahamas is the Bahamian dollar, right? How can we have many places now that do not accept the Bahamian dollar, even government agencies? How can are we going to change the act or are we going to insist that those places accept back, I mean,
It's a good
accept back
question.
the Bahamian dollar?
That's a good question. This tender is legal tender, but I don't accept it.
Well, I look at it this way. Um, Sometimes I think a business, now the government has to also lead and address financial inclusion and related issues. What is important in this is that you have the opportunity to pay the individual however they demand to be paid. And the problem you have is that if somebody says, no, 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 I don't accept cash, there's somebody here that can't pay for the service because they don't have the non-cash means of making payment. So I think that's a part of it. And then in many cases too, some of us say, oh, I'm walking around with no cash in my pocket. And so we don't patronize certain businesses that only accept cash. So think about, how those businesses sometimes get deprived of potential customers because those businesses also can't fully outfit themselves to accept non-cash payments. So I think a part of the issue is to as well make certain that when you say it's financial inclusion, it means that everyone has an opportunity to choose from the range of options. And in some cases, for the small businesses, they would love to be able to accept the credit card from the tourists. So we got to make sure that they can get a merchant account. And in other cases, you would love to go into some establishment and spend on the services, but you need a card to do so. So you also need to be empowered to do so or to pay with your digital currency.
But that's a legitimate point. But if you accepting the government $5 and you accepting the government $20 and you ain't accept the government $100 bill, same delivery of currency. That's where I think there's a challenge.
Well,
When
I,
you
rem-
get to
I
say to me,
remember
I'm
I
not going to
remember
accept
an
your hundred
incident.
dollars.
I remember an incident the other day. I don't know whether they accept cash or charge, but things were so rough. The guy says, "Look, man, the only thing I can accept is cash. I can't accept nothing else."
No, but cash. I see the point with cash versus non-cash. But if you accepting $5 from the government, if you accepting $10 issued by the central bank, if you accepting $50 issued by the central bank, how you gonna tell me you gonna take the central bank $100? And
Well,
and all are subject to fraud to fraud.
so I think everyone can understand um, the motivation for why the government's receipting system uh, transformed the way it did, right? But it doesn't take from the fact that you want to make certain that everyone who's making payments have a similar level of convenience in interacting with the government. So I don't think there's any loss of that point. But I think at the same time that to the extent that you decide to go into business tomorrow and you decide you want to be you don't want to accept cash, you should have the right to say that. I just need to make certain that you saying you do not accept cash is not a pretext for you not wanting a certain clientele.
Stop printing $100 bills.
Good afternoon. Now, you're talking about companies, we should accept whatever they say that they are, the way that they want, whether it's cash or card. The government, if you want to get a police record, they're asking that you go online and you pay, and then you get it. So the government itself is putting a constraint on persons to say this is the only way we want it. Now, I know personally, I was happy that the government finally, had some things online. But now, in some instances, they only want you to go online.
No, I think we can work to um, improve the access. And what this is illustrating is that if you're having a digital transformation or digital economy, it has to be 100% inclusive. And so we have to make sure that we empower everyone um, to transact on the same level with government.